What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin along with John Kropsic. And John, sometimes when we talk about America and where our social and political system is headed, we have to talk inevitably about other countries because they have an impact on the way we go about business here in the United States. And I don't think there's any country that we have to look to with more, trepidation or awareness, at least, than the Chinese.
I agree. I think we should be aware of China. We should be really aware of China because they've been stealing secrets from us. They're building their military. They have a huge, huge military, and they have a force of men that makes our military look small. So, I mean, it's a big problem with China.
Well, they also have that one-child policy, and there was that whole issue of having too many men and whether, in fact, there was a safety valve that would be needed where they would set these guys off into some kind of forward action militarily because, well, it could all come back on the government. We haven't seen signs of that necessarily yet.
No, but I think there's a lot of signs that, like I said, they're building their military. They're making threats to Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I don't know if we're in really a shape anymore to take on a China.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I just read an account of our military preparedness, and there were some concerns raised about Russia and China and some of the cyber activity that's been going on in both of these countries that suggests that they might be moving ahead of us in advanced weaponry. So that's something that we here at America Trends will keep our eye on. But we are also going to be talking immediately about the economy of China because some projections suggest that it will be the largest economy in the world by 2030. And John, we're already at 2019.
Yeah, that's not too far away. So that's something to look forward to, I guess.
Well, when you think about it, I mean, what does it mean if we are not the leading economic power in the world? We have always taken for granted that no one could touch us, the superiority we had in economics, in the way that we knew how to make a buck and how we knew to build incredible products, that was never going to be superseded in our lifetimes.
Yeah, but you know what? I think our debt is what's holding us down. I mean, they're smart now. They're going to countries and lending them money like we used to do, and they're getting in, and they're really, they're taking our playbook and bettering it. So, like I said, I think we got to keep a close eye on them. That it's not all, it could be part of setting up bases, military bases, as far as with the economic stuff. So,
well, we don't know what their Belt and Road Initiative really means. But I will say this, John. Just as we've kind of let the balloon bubble and fizz for the United States in the last couple of moments, let's also think about this. China itself may well have some economic problems that they mask through the way they do their accounting, the way that their control and command economy works. We may not see some of the weaknesses inherent in their system because the way they account for things, for example, they'll build a big brand new city and it looks fantastic. And then you look at it at night and in major skyscrapers, there's two lights on because nobody lives there. And yet they count that as gross domestic product because they built something that is not being utilized.
I guess they needed something for the people to do. You're right. I mean, there's probably a lot of things that we don't know about that. As long as they have control, it's communist rule. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to know.
Well, that's probably true. But we have got a guest, John, who is really so aware of the true state of the economy of China and its implications for the United States. George Magnus has written a book called Red Flags. Now, that gives you an idea why Xi's China is in jeopardy. So all things are not quite as rosy. And in fact, to his point, we recorded this a few weeks back. And in the meantime, I see where some of the investments they've made in Africa have not been paying off, and they may have to seize some of the property that they built for one of the countries in Africa. So maybe they're getting a little bit overextended as well. But we're going to learn a lot more in the next half hour about this issue. So America, China, our economies, we know that they relate to each other. We know how important this relationship is, but how well are they really doing, and how worried should we be here on America Trends? George Magnus is with us. He's written the book Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. And George, a fascinating book. I thought, though, that China was ascending dramatically, a real rising star in the world orbit. What's going on in China that gives you concerns enough to write a book saying that there are red flags, including 4 major ones that you want to help us understand?
Well, I think, Larry, when you look over your shoulder and you just kind of take a glimpse about where you've come from or where China has come from, it's not only easy, it's actually quite appropriate to be wowed by just the speed of change and the sheer sort of impressive nature of what China has managed to achieve. If you look around you, kind of where you happen to be now and where China is or has been during the last few years, it is possible to basically break away from that narrative a little bit and just kind of reflect on the fact that, just like they say that, the future doesn't always remember the past, and actually what's going on in China today doesn't necessarily resemble all of the great things that have happened over the last 30 or 40 years. So in many ways, I think what's happened is that since the financial crisis that we had in 2007, 2008, which also rolled into China, by the way, although it manifested itself in a very, very different way. But China's economy has changed. It's not quite the kind of all singing, all dancing kind of economy that it certainly was during the 90s and the 2000s. It's got a number of problems, which I've kind of tried to explain in the book. And above all, I think the governance system in China has changed under Xi Jinping. So a lot of the book is about the president and about the impact that his coming to power has had on China. And this is not the China that most of us have known during the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades, because Xi Jinping's governance system really is a bit of a throwback to the way that things used to be under Mao Tse Tung. It's more controlling, it's more authoritarian, it's more stifling of initiative, it's more repressive, and I think this is significant, really, when we think about problem solving. And actually we have many, many similar kind of issues in the Western world ourselves today, where
Absolutely.
we're finding it difficult to solve problems for the same reasons. So China is in many ways no different.
Why is it that he has ascended in the way that he has to power for a lifetime, in effect? What brought that on, if in fact the success that we've seen under Deng Xiaoping and others really was done with a certain political dynamism for the system that it was? Why have they decided to revert perhaps back to a more Maoist tendency?
That's a great question. So I should say that the popular kind of view, which is that Xi Jinping is potentially president for life, is indeed something that occurred at the annual meeting of China's parliament in March of this year, which is what they call the National People's Congress, when the term limits on the role of the president, which typically were 10 years before, were abandoned. So in effect, if he wanted to, and if the party were happy with his, with him, then he could actually stay on as president for an awfully long time. But actually, his power really derived from other sources. his power derives from the fact that he's head of the Communist Party and also of the Central Military Commission. Neither of these two roles are subject to term limits. So, in a way, all of the fascination that we saw in the kind of media and in the West in March of this year was justified, but actually it didn't really. The real issue is the fact that he was already a very, very powerful president. Now, the other issue that you kind of raised is really about why this has all kind of changed and why Xi Jinping is a different president from his predecessors. Really goes back to the year or the years leading up to his coming to power. And in fact, during 2012, which was the year in which he came to power, was a year in which there was a lot of factional infighting in the Communist Party. And it was not clear until he actually did emerge from the 18th Party Congress as the president of China. It wasn't clear at all that this was what was going to happen. There were lots of people, well, not lots, but there were several people who were vying for that position. One of them is a man called Bo Xilai, who was governor of Chongqing province, is now kind of in prison or under house arrest, and was kind of one of the early victims of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. And he really, I think, he was kind of the school, really, within the party that believed that under his predecessors, who were Hu Jintao as president and Wen Jiabao, who was the premier or the prime minister, he believed that under the previous incumbents over a 10-year period, that the Communist Party got lazy, unresponsive, and undisciplined. And he vowed, basically, to repair all of those faults as he saw them, because he worried quite a lot that the Chinese Communist Party could go the way of its Soviet peer, which, as we know, collapsed. And according to the Chinese narrative, at least, nobody was there, or nobody's kind of stood up for the party or tried to defend it or strengthen it. So everything that we've seen really since 2012 under Xi Jinping has really been about strengthening the party, strengthening the state apparatus, as I said before, kind of increasing the kind of controlling and authoritarian nature of the government, and becoming more repressive and in the interests of the party, because the party is seen as the guardian of stability in China and the guarantor of prosperity in the future. That's at least what they believe.
I remember a story, Rupert Murdoch going to Beijing and meeting with lots of business leaders, and he said to them, gee, everybody talks about the Communist Party and its stranglehold on so much of the economy and the society, and yet I haven't met a communist. And yet they were all communists in the room. I mean, are we misled in believing that this is kind of a, capitalist society light?
Well, yes, this is, again, a good question, but very complex. It's clear that, the Communist Party in China is not like the Communist Party in North Korea or like the Soviet Communist Party was. They do not practice they talk a lot about Marxism, Leninism, but the way in which certainly the economy is run is, I wouldn't say it's what we call in the West kind of a mixed economy, but they have adapted what they call marketization, which is basically the use of market mechanisms, and they have nurtured entrepreneurship, and they have been quite open up until now about absorbing lessons from the Western world and also taking on board kind of Western technology and adapting it for local purposes. All of these things actually have constituted important ways in which China has become, what should we say, less communist or more, a blend of state control and the judicious use of markets up to a point. And the deserved reputation which the Chinese have earned over the last decades is one of pragmatism and flexibility and technocratic goodness, if you want to put it that way. And all of these things are true. But I'd stress it's really until now, because I think that now we are beginning to see changes in the way in which the so-called Chinese model is evolving. And in fact, in recent weeks, there have been a handful, only perhaps even less than a handful, but very significant interventions by prominent Chinese intellectuals and professors that basically make precisely this point, which is that what Xi Jinping champions as the Chinese model, they argue is actually untrue and leading China into a kind of a confrontation with the West, and that China should be more realistic about the basis for its success, which was really about kind of incorporating things that they learned to adjust and to adapt from the West. Whether this actually has any traction in China today is a moot point, because these intellectuals, significant though they are, obviously do not determine policy, and, their work has been taken down from the Chinese internet. However, it just does go to show, really, that there is some disquiet in China today about the direction in which Xi Jinping is taking the country, because it is, well, certainly from my point of view, I think a sort of a retrograde move, really, which is going to frustrate the achievement or the fulfillment of the goals which they have, to make China richer and more innovative and so on and so forth. So obviously this will all be determined in years to come, but I think that this kind of political shift that's taken place in China is not necessarily conducive to what it would like to achieve.
Well, you say there are signs starting to appear of a possible economic slowdown. How can we even trust their GDP numbers? I've read where they consider it GDP growth when they build a city that is then not habited by any human beings, but they've got all kinds of building and construction activity going on, and therefore they can count it as activity, even if it's seemingly purposeless.
Yeah, this is a great point. So this is the difference between the way that we and say China think about GDP, right? So when we do GDP, we build things, we make things, we spend money on things, and at the end of the quarter or the end of the year, we kind of calculate all of these things and we say, right, that's what GDP was. And if somebody built a factory that doesn't make any money, or we build a bridge that actually falls down or something like that, obviously we have to kind of depreciate that very quickly. Even if it's not done immediately, then it's done. Our accounting regulations and our corporate governance systems basically stipulate that we have to account for bad investment or bad misallocated spending, on a reasonable kind of time frame. Now, this doesn't happen in China. In China, you start off with the GDP target, which happens to be about 6.5%, and then you just make it happen, whatever it is that you have to do, and that's really what happens. So to be fair, the GDP numbers, the very kind of that kind of top level kind of economic measurement, is I think somewhat suspect. It doesn't display very much volatility. There's no kind of cyclicality, so we don't really know anything about the kind of quarters in the economy. Chinese produce completely, rotten statistics. They produce a wealth of data, some of which actually is very good, but just not at that kind of very low level of abstraction. In other words, the big sort of aggregated data tend to be rather fanciful, shall we say. And I think that private forecasters and private analysts have for some time actually tried to kind of evolve and develop their own kind of models of what they think is going on in China. And the probability is that even though the official numbers say that China is growing at about 6.6 or 6.7%, most private forecasters that kind of do this kind of thing think that it's somewhere between 4 and 5 and a bit.
The book is called Red Flags by George Magnus, looking at some of the problems that may await China after an incredible period of growth and change. Let's briefly describe what they are. First, let's start with the debt trap. You talk about that. How important is it for us to understand? We talk about debt here in the United States. What about in China?
Yeah, so this is what I think is the most pressing of China's major issues. We could add trade as a sort of a newly pressing issue, actually, but that's more kind of an external issue. But debt really is becoming, or it has become, a big problem for China. And I think, and the main problem here is the speed with which it has accumulated, which is really from about 100% of GDP in 2008, which is just 10 years ago, to now probably about 340% by the middle of 2018.
Wow. And we're told in the U.S. that we're
financial
approaching 100%, and that puts us in a real danger zone.
Well, to be fair, the number that you talked about in the context of the U.S. is federal debt.
Mm-hmm.
But in the numbers that I'm using for China actually include government debt plus private debt plus the financial sector. So it's a slightly different basis of comparison. If you wanted to do like for like, then China's government debt or public sector debt is probably it's rather opaque, but actually the IMF thinks it's probably somewhere in the region of around 60 or 65% of GDP. So it is somewhat lower than in the United States or the United Kingdom, for example, but it has been climbing quite quickly since 2008. And, of course, there's also a lot of debt owned by state entities, which we don't have to the same degree. So once you kind of consolidate it all, it's probably a bit of a wash. And I think that, China's debt is a problem, partly because a lot of the debt that has been accumulated is misallocated lending, to loss-making enterprises or to borrowers that can't really afford to pay interest back, or in some cases even repay their loans. But the Chinese also have a problem that was not dissimilar to the one that we had in the late 2000s, which is that a lot of the debt that has been built up has been funded at very, very short maturities. And the issue in financial systems that banks don't usually go bust because they're insolvent, but they invariably fail when they become illiquid because the deposits on which they're dependent suddenly disappear or are withdrawn. And it is one of the features of the Chinese banking system that more and more during the last 10 years, the banks that are not in the top 5, shall we say, have become more dependent on much riskier forms of borrowing in wholesale markets or overnight or at short maturities. So obviously the Chinese authorities are well aware of this, and we've had, for the last 18 months or so, what they call a kind of a deleveraging campaign in which some of the bigger risks in the financial system have been controlled much more effectively, and the growth of credit to some borrowers has slowed down quite a lot. But as we speak, Larry, this is a year or certainly a quarter in which some of the Chinese government's measures to control credit and leverage have actually been relaxed, and the government itself has come out with statements to say that it's starting to get rather worried about the slowdown in the economy, and they will take measures to try to correct that. So this is a moving feast, and we don't really know that the government will have the stomach to see this through just yet.
Tie together this with the renminbi trap that you talk about, their currency, and the fact that that currency isn't really let out a whole lot, as the American dollar is now the reserve around the world. What about their currency?
Well, it's been a bone of contention, particularly for the U.S. Treasury in years gone by. because the charge really was always that the Chinese kind of were artificially holding their currency down, and for a while that certainly was true. I think at the moment the problem isn't really that they're holding the currency down. I think the problem is that they're trying to stop it from depreciating further than it might otherwise do, because the dollar is so strong on the one hand, and on the other, that as the Chinese economy slows down, and because of the weight of liquidity that's kind of sloshing around in the Chinese financial system, there is a sort of a pressure for the renminbi to drop, which they don't resist it completely, because they do have a system for allowing the currency to fluctuate within a limited kind of terms of reference. The danger, I think, that a lot of people have just started to worry about, I think, during the last few months, really, since the trade conflict actually started to become more serious, is that because the Chinese have now run out of American goods on which to impose punitive tariffs, because they're pretty much, they've matched the United States dollar for dollar, and now, because of the imbalance in trade, America can still put higher tariffs on more Chinese goods, but the Chinese have kind of run out of scope. So what people worry about is that the Chinese might actually devalue the currency in order to fight back or compensate against any further broadening of the tariffs by the White House. And that would be quite a dangerous thing to do, I think. Dangerous because I think it would really cause a lot of consternation, not just in the White House, actually, but actually in a lot of emerging markets as well. And I think it would be an act of self-harm, because the Chinese are really quite sensitive to broad stability in the renminbi US dollar rate. And if they suspected that the government was in the process of devaluing it, or paying ignoring the kind of stability, I think it might encourage people to try to move their capital offshore in a more substantial way than is happening anyway, and that could be a cause of great consternation for Beijing. So this, in one way, the renminbi trap is really about how do you keep the currency stable that actually A, looks like it wants to go down anyway because of what's going on in China, but B, is being exacerbated by possibly the trade conflict as well.
I don't want to run out of time before we allow you to attack the issue of the demographic trap that they have created for themselves, and the middle income trap. But if we can digest those in bite-sized chunks, that would be great.
Sure. So the aging trap or the demographic trap is not unique to China. It's actually almost a minority of countries in the world that either don't face the issues of rapid aging, either now or at some point in the next 20 or 30 years. Perhaps Africa would be the last place on Earth that will actually experience societal aging. But the problem is that China is doing or its age structure is changing probably at the fastest rate of any country on the planet. So, it's obviously China is not as old as Japan, but it's aging faster than anybody else. And in the next 22 years, China will age as quickly as we have done in the West over the last 75 years. And of course, they're doing this at a rate of income per head, which is a fraction of what it has been for us during the last 40 years or so. So the phrase "getting old before you get rich" was really kind of invented for China, because rapid aging, low per capita income, and there are things you can do about it, but it's quite complicated. And obviously, in the process of going through this aging process, China really does need to try to beef up, the benefit levels of pensions and healthcare spending, where it lags a long way behind the West. So
and you say that, of course, the middle income trap is because they've gone from a low income economy to a middle income economy. But what's the risk there?
Yeah, so empirically, if we look back over the last 60 or 70 years, we've seen many instances of countries that have grown out of poverty to become middle-income countries, but only a couple of handfuls of countries have actually succeeded in becoming rich, having become middle income. And China's challenge is to kind of join that very small group of countries, if it can. And in a nutshell, what the book argues is kind of an argument, or is a sort of a synopsis of what people kind of think about this, is that the key to becoming rich has to do with the quality of your institutions, like the legal system, the competitive environment, the regulatory environment, how good you are at adapting technical progress, and how you can combine all of these things to generate faster productivity growth. And if you think back to what we've been talking about with regard to China's governance system, my concern about this is, well, my concern, I don't think we can say categorically China will not break out of the middle-income trap, but I do have concerns that the governance system may restrict its ability to do so.
And you do feel that Xi's authoritarian and repressive approach is likely to come into conflict with the economic aspirations of many in the country. And we have thought historically that we might see more democracy and more flourishing of individual rights as people gain more and more economically. Can the two continue to exist side by side, economic improvement and repressive political constructs?
Well, there's the 64 trillion yuan question. So I think that we've learned now that that was a mistake that our policymakers basically believed in. I mean, they believed that if we were only, if we tried to engage with China more and more and more, and they changed and became a little bit more liberal, that eventually they would either democratize or that we'd all be singing from the same page. And clearly we know now that that was flawed, because I don't think it was ever going to happen, but it's been proven now, I think, that China has clearly become has evolved into having an adversarial relationship with the United States and with the Western world in matters of trade and technology and investment and so on. And it is going to paddle its own canoe, and Xi Jinping is going to try to mold the Chinese narrative in a very different way. I mean, he calls it socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. I mean, that's the very kind of cumbersome sounding narrative or title of the narrative. So yeah, I think that will be the kind of acid test for China, is whether as the fabled middle class in China becomes richer over time and becomes larger as more people kind of join it, and given that China is going through a period, as we all are, in which social media is proving to have powers that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents never knew, whether that combination really can kind of thrive in the face of a repressive government. So long as the Chinese government keeps delivering year after year after year rising prosperity without making any major errors that cause people upset or disquiet, everything's fine. But it's a bit of a stretch to believe that one-man rule will never make a mistake. And when he does slip up or when he does make a mistake, then of course there's nowhere else for the blame to fall. Yeah, that's why I think I kind of put in the title the thing about being in jeopardy is not because I think the communist regime will collapse necessarily, but I think we are very likely to see instability in terms of policy formulation and perhaps even in terms of political relationships as well.
Well, I think you have outlined what he has to avoid, the various traps, and I thank you for sharing those today with our audience. I hope you will read this book, George Magnus, Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. And thank you for being with us today on America Trends.
Thank you, Larry.